Welcome to the podcast today. My name is Jeff, and I'll be your host. And our topic today is putting never again into practice. And we'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. My guest today is a returning guest. Mike Fegelman is the Executive Director of HonestReporting Canada and a 17-year veteran of the Canadian journalism industry. He's Executive Director of that organization and has testified before parliamentary committees and has given testimony to the Standing Senate Committee for Transport and Communications to express HRC's concerns about the CBC's reporting of Israel in the Middle East. His opinions and views are widely sought out for by Canada's media and political elite, and his work has been published in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the National Post, Le Devoir, Montreal Gazette, Ottawa Citizen, and many more. Mike, that's your big introduction, and welcome back to the podcast today.
It's my great pleasure, Jeff. Thank you for having me again.
Well, it's always good to hear from you. And today we're talking about this idea of putting never again into practice. And of course, this is in relation to Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is coming this Thursday. The United Nations General Assembly designated January 27th, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's the day that's set aside to specifically remember the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and millions of other victims of the Nazi regime, and to promote education that prevents future genocides. But this is the question we want to ask today. How do we really ensure that the Holocaust never happens again? How do we put that never again sort of concept into practice? And so I'm going to just start with this first question and ask, have you ever been to Auschwitz-Birkenau? What was your experience?
I have. It was many years ago. And, for your listeners and viewers, what I want you to picture is a city-sized area, an industrial killing machine that is flanked by homes and residences, a city. It wasn't in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't that the neighboring communities didn't know. There is no ignorance. It was well known, and this was their backyard. And if the searing memory of the barracks, the just killing areas with crematoria and gas chambers, it's something you can't even, you have to see to really understand just the scale of what was organized. And to your original point, when we look at the Holocaust, we know that the Holocaust, it didn't start with gas chambers. It started with words. It started with the dehumanization of Jews, the making it rational to malign and to expose Jews to bigotry, to disenfranchise them, deny them of equal rights in a time of great economic and political uncertainty that allowed for real racism and toxicity, that allowed for the level to the point where it allowed a pathway to a genocide of a people, something that's never happened before. And it's incredibly dangerous, and why we commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is this Thursday, January 27th, which marks the day that Auschwitz-Birkenau camp was liberated, is to fundamentally make a clarion call to action to ensure that this never happens again. It's not just a cliched word. We really need to do this with education, with sensitizing, and making sure that the Holocaust isn't diminished, that's not trivialized, and that it's not been excused as some kind of a conspiracy theory concocted by Jews to ask for sympathy, which is what a lot of hate mongers will pronounce. Yeah,
absolutely. And my experience at Auschwitz-Birkenau was very similar. I mean, I don't think anybody can go there and not feel the feelings that that you described, and the horror at the just stark reality of it all as you walk through this place. And I think one of the things that just blew me away about my entire trip through Poland, and we visited many of the camps. One of the things that blew me away was the fact that we hear about the Holocaust and we hear it in terms of numbers. We read words and, we think about this statistical thing that happened. But when you go to these places and you walk through them and you understand the physical trauma, the dehumanization that occurred there, it is just absolutely something that catches in your throat. It's horrifying. And a couple of the images that I just, can't get out of my mind. I was sharing some pictures with our producer, Laura, earlier. One was the glass case with some of the shoes that, were kept from Auschwitz-Birkenau, from the victims there. And another case, similar display with some of the hair, that was removed from those victims before they were gassed. Horrific images. And you're right. We have to find a way to help people understand why this concept of never again is so important. And that really, it behooves us to fight back against anti-Semitism in our day because of the fact that, that it still exists, which in some ways is almost beyond comprehension. After something like the Holocaust happened, how do we still have anti-Semitism? And, we've discussed that before. Maybe you want to just add a thought there with regard to that, just that idea. How is this still around?
Sure. Well, let's start with the statistics. Let's look at Canada first and foremost. Canadian Jews are the #1 victims of hate crimes. In the past year alone, there was a 63% increase in the kind of attacks that were waged against the Jewish people, whether it's harassment, whether it's graffiti, or whether it's actual physical violence. Why anti-Semitism happens? Look, fundamentally, anti-Semitism is an irrational hatred of the Jewish people. It is not a rational hatred. Would be somebody did something and you have a problem with it. It is not that Jews did something or are culpable. We are accused of being communists. We are accused of being capitalists. It is a morphing, mutating disease where Jews are exposed to every kind of condemnation. And I've heard a lot of different people and experts talk about how anti-Semitism fundamentally comes down to individuals wanting to escape responsibility for various instances. We're seeing it very present day with contemporary false analogies of the Holocaust and COVID with respect to vaccines and vaccine mandates. And it's another way of trivializing the Holocaust and making it so that it could be perhaps a subjective, not an objective issue. And that's what it comes down to. It is that fundamental denial. And I deal with this a lot in the work that we do at Honest Reporting Canada, because there is a bleeding of a tendency for media and other people to deny objectivity and to claim that what are objective facts are really just subjective claims. And, when you look at the scale of 6 million, it's tough to even wrap your head around that. And what I'd encourage your viewers and listeners to do is try to appreciate one Holocaust survivor. And by that, I would encourage them to read a memoir of a Holocaust survivor, to know their experiences, to know the story. Post the Holocaust and the end of the Second World War, there were 40,000 Jews who came to Canada to seek refuge, of course. We are, I think 78 some odd years from the Holocaust. We only have, we're probably the last generation to have the opportunity to hear witness testimony from Holocaust survivors. So, and there are really, I'm going to say, like a handful out there who are able to speak on the topic. I think it behooves everyone, especially our educators, to make sure that people are sensitized and have that dialogue and relationship and are educated by people who have firsthand witness testimony of what transpired. And it's important that that this is continuously documented in a world that, whether it's on social media, in the United Nations or elsewhere, that is trying to deny the Jewish people their victimhood, what has actually transpired.
Yeah. Mike, maybe you could recommend just a couple of things, a couple of biographies that people could read that would be helpful to them?
Well, so I'll acknowledge my personal bias, which is that my wife is actually a Holocaust educator. Her name is Jody Fegelman, and she works for an organization, a nonprofit Canadian organization called the Azrieli Foundation, and is the director of the Holocaust Survivors Memoirs Project. And you can go to their website, and it has dozens and dozens of books that they've published, that they've fact-checked, and that are heavily resourced, and that are available for free for every public institution, for every school, that your viewers and listeners can see. I think it's unbelievable that you could go to a day school and not get real Holocaust education. The world's largest massacre of a people, an unprecedented one that really set the precedent.
And where can they access this website? Do you have the information there?
The URL is azrielifoundation.org. That's
Okay.
AZRIELI foundation.org. And there's a subsection for the Holocaust Survivors Memoirs program.
Perfect. We'll make sure that that gets printed on the screen, and that would be something that will help people to actually go and learn themselves. We want to give you tools and resources as you watch and as you listen to put this idea of never again into practice. And I think that's one very practical way. Now, Mike, let's go back for a little bit. How do you think, I've tried to wrap my mind around this many times, how do you think it was possible for a plan to completely eradicate all Jews in Europe to become accepted and then implemented in a modern, supposedly very progressive culture such as Germany in the 30s and 40s?
Yeah, so it didn't start with the final solution. Right, like that is a common misconception that happens, that it was immediately, the plan of the Nazis and Hitler that they were going to immediately exterminate the Jews. It started with words. It started with language that brought out toxicity and waged bigotry against the Jewish people, solely the Jewish people, that led to certain laws which denied Jewish people the right to self-determination, to own property, to own businesses, that then led to pogroms, that led then to forced isolation in certain areas, that then led to relegating Jews to work camps and concentration camps, and then led to their extermination in gas chambers and crematoria. It was a climate and that some people are saying we're seeing embers of today, of real polarization, of heated rhetoric to the point that sees Jews as the number one scapegoats of every possible issue, and then really in the crosshairs of people's bigotry and hatred. So when we see individuals rise up in levels of power and leadership who are xenophobes, who have anti-Jewish sympathies, it's a great cause of concern, and it needs to be stamped out. More than anything, it needs to be proactively done and not reactively. It's a simple thing to say is education and awareness, but there has to be legal consequence to people who rise up and really take avowed efforts to deny people the Jewish victim out of the genocide. And I want to give a contemporary example of something that we noticed this week of an outrageous anti-Jewish conspiracy theory that was published in a publication called the Toronto Caribbean, which dubs itself as the leading Caribbean newspaper for Canadians, which had a commentator who claimed that Canadian, British, and American politicians kowtow to Jewish lobbyists. I'm quoting that verbatim. Like this is in line with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Jewish trope of the trope of how Jews control world governments. I raised this, and I'm sure you and many people who are listening are aware of what transpired a little over a week ago, where we had the terror attack at the Colleyville Beth Israel synagogue, where the individual came into the synagogue armed with a gun, took 4 people hostage, including the rabbi. And his motive, the reason why he did this, is because he claims he wanted to have freed an Al-Qaeda operative who had murdered some American soldiers and officials in Afghanistan many years ago. Her name was Afia Siddiqui. And the reason he came to the synagogue is because he believed that if he took a rabbi hostage, the rabbi would have a pathway to President Biden and to other senior officials in the American administration who could then free the Al-Qaeda terrorist. I say this because this is the danger of real conspiracy theories, because they incite people, they incite radicals to take up arms and to take up violence against innocent Jewish people. And you look at a couple of years prior to, you had the attack in 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue by Jeffrey Bowers. He came in, automatic rifle, shot up the place, killed 11 people in the worst massacre in a place of worship. And what concerns us more than anything is there were attempts to minimize, perhaps even whitewash, that the attack was an anti-Semitic attack. There were news organizations that were inclined to perhaps not reference the anti-Semitic element of it. Even the FBI didn't initially label it an anti-Semitic attack. And yet the perpetrator came on the Jewish Sabbath during prayer at a place of worship to a synagogue to attack Jewish parishioners. Now, if there was a similar attack at a church, it would be anti-Christian. If there was a similar attack at a mosque, it would be anti-Muslim, and so forth. But for some reason, and it escapes me because I can't understand it, the media, the FBI, and others try to minimize the fact that it was a premeditated attack against Jews based on an anti-Semitic trope. So we know the power that words have in fanning the flames of hatred. We see this on social media, and it's a tremendous cause of concern because it goes viral, and there are no boundaries and there are no bounds.
No, and so these are, definitively examples of anti-Semitism, but also examples where the media tends to feed either conspiracies about the Jews or to downplay, the anti-Jewish sentiment in these certain acts. Can you provide any other examples where the media feeds these conspiracies, and why is this so dangerous?
Well, it's dangerous because it grants legitimacy to them, right? So I think I would look at actually the instances not of commission but of omission. That when these instances happen where there are these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the media aren't necessarily covering them. We exposed this incident that I mentioned about this Toronto Caribbean newspaper, which had an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I would certainly hope that the mainstream media would cover it, but I doubt. And I think that perhaps the most egregious form of bias and the greatest obstacle and impediment to safeguarding civilians and our way of life is to shed a light on these important issues. That's what we're dealing with, is for the public, for it not to be on the periphery of the public by the media. We know that what's reported today becomes foreign policy tomorrow, and if our media are not going to cover these issues, there's no way that we're going to get, we look at security funding for Jewish and other Jewish institutions and other places of worship. If it's not on the priority list for our politicians as they're informed by the media, and quite frankly, the number one source of information is through the mainstream media, we're not going to have adequate policies. And I say this as I'm the former president of my synagogue, and I actually sat on the security committee of my shul. I know how important security infrastructure funding is. To go to a synagogue shouldn't be, or to any place of worship, it shouldn't be a courageous act. But for Jews to go to their synagogue, they have to have, in a sense, security training. When you walk in, you almost instinctively think, okay, where's the closest exit? There's a chair in front of me. Maybe I will repurpose that chair and fashion it into a weapon should there be an attack. You go to places in Europe, to get in, you have to give your passport to confirm your identity. You have an armed guard, perhaps with an automatic rifle, who's guarding your place of worship. This is not what we want. We don't want a society that, we have to batter down the hatches in order to have a relationship with our divine creator. But it's coming to that. It's coming to that because of the level of toxicity out there.
And how sad is it that we have to even think about those things when, coming together with a faith community to worship, whether, Jewish or Muslim or Christian, it doesn't matter, but particularly Jewish, as we're discussing today. And we know that from these examples, from Colleyville and from the incident in California a while back and Pittsburgh, and, anti-Semitism is definitely on the rise. You shared the Canadian statistics, and really in the world today, anti-Semitism is on the rise. We can corroborate that, right, with the statistics that we're seeing these days?
Oh, there's no question. And American Jews are the number one victims of hate crimes out there. I think you can associate a lot of the blame for the rise in anti-Semitism on the virality and virulence of social media, which has allowed, back in yesteryear, bigots and hate mongers were on the peripheries of society. Maybe they would write a blog or have a newsletter. Now they're able to usurp a platform where if they put up a hashtag, their hateful, toxic message is ubiquitous and it can go viral. And it goes, quite frankly, rather unchecked. And unfortunately, there is almost a hands-off policy from far too many social media outlets who, to a degree, are almost outsourcing this vetting protocol to the masses. But, there's not a day that goes by that my staff don't flag a hateful, anti-Semitic, or Holocaust-denying comment. And I got to tell you, Jeff, so many times do we have a moderator at these platforms who will say, well, that's permissible speech. This is happening on a regular basis. Wow. And fundamentally, it's going to have to come down to a consequence to the platforms if they're going to be a host to hateful commentary, whether that's punitive, some kind of a government-sanctioned regime that affixes a financial penalty for their failing to rein in hate. A classic example that a lot of people in my business talk about is, on Twitter, for example, you have Iran's supreme leader who calls for the Jewish people's annihilation and for the eradication of the state of Israel. A clear-cut incitement to genocide, illegal under international law, and yet it is considered permissible speech. Permissible, right? The term that the Twitter representatives used was that it was tantamount to saber rattling, and again, it's rationalizing and justifying that kind of discourse, and it's interesting because Twitter, it's very famous for the fact that they deplatformed former President Donald Trump, and you can discuss the logic or lack thereof for that decision, but they would keep Ayatollah Khomeini on Twitter where he has a reach of millions and millions of people. How can that be justifiable? How can hate mongers have a platform to disseminate toxicity? There have to be laws. There have to be legal consequences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What you say makes complete and total sense to me, and I'm sure to many who are watching and listening, and I think it's helpful for us to see those perspectives and make those comparisons. I want to go back to something you said. In a minute, I want to talk about a little bit more of what we were just talking about, but I want to go back to something you said about security protocols at synagogues, and we were talking about how sad it is that, people of in any faith community would have to think about those kind of things. I had a conversation with somebody recently who wanted to know, why is there, poverty in Israel? How come this happens? And I believe that one of the explanations has to be that Israel's defense budget needs to be so high that there isn't always, the kind of funding left over for social programming that they would like to have. And again, this is this sad situation where a country has to think about first and foremost defending themselves from enemies all around. Is that a fair comparison?
I think it certainly is part of the reason for there to be Jews below the poverty line within Israel proper. There's no question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look at and the fact that certain social programs can't be carried out. When you think about how Israel has to invest billions upon billions of dollars for security preparedness and to have its armed forces and to have the necessary weaponry to repel against its detractors across its borders who are seeking its annihilation. And you think about how it's always on a war footing, certainly as it relates to Iran. Those funds could naturally be given to important social programs and helping people get out of poverty, but can't. And that's just the challenge when you are always on an existential footing. Which the Jewish people are. And you look at Iranian leaders, they call Israel the one bomb country. They call it that because they know that they drop, should Iran acquire a weapon of mass destruction, they could drop a nuclear weapon and have, pretty much anonymity and be protected by their terror proxies, whether it's Hezbollah, who has 150,000 rockets on Israel's border in Lebanon, or Hamas in Gaza, or as we saw in the past week, how an Iranian proxy, the Houthis, are firing rockets at the UAE and Saudi Arabia. This is what Iran's trying to do. They're trying to create a stranglehold and try to get hegemony in the region to really take over and wreak havoc.
Yeah. Now, while we're talking about that, how can we tell the difference? I mean, so Israel gets blamed for a lot of things in the world media today, and we understand that Israel as a nation doesn't always do everything correct. So how can we tell the difference between balanced criticism of Israel and actual anti-Israel, anti-Semitic rhetoric?
It's a very important, really good question. The first thing I would say is Israel, like all democracies, is deserving of criticism. It is not immune to it. Criticism is healthy in every democracy, and if you go to Israel, you go to the Israeli Knesset, its parliament, you will hear perhaps the most robust debate and diversity of opinions that you'll ever find. That's a healthy thing. In terms of discerning between what is legitimate criticism and what isn't, there's if you look at what's called the 3D approach that was articulated by Natan Sharansky, which talks about how when Israel is demonized, delegitimized, and held to a double standard, that veers into anti-Semitism. When, for example, the United Nations singles out Israel in the past year, I believe, with 14 UN General Assembly resolutions, and I believe only 4 for other countries, that's singling out the Jewish state. The same can be said for the scrutiny that Israel is under with respect to the media. Other classic examples of anti-Semitism that we see, whether it's social media, traditional, when people make contemporary comparisons of Israelis to the Nazis, that's anti-Semitism. When Jews are accused of dual loyalties of like Canadian Jews to Israel, that's an example of anti-Semitism. And what's important is this is all mapped out and defined and internationally accepted in a codified record and document called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, of which Canada is a signatory. The challenge is how this definition, which is also accepted by many provinces and jurisdiction, how it can actually be implemented with teeth on the ground.
Yeah. You mentioned diversity within the within the Knesset and the nation of Israel. Let's talk a little bit about the term apartheid state, because this gets thrown around a lot, and it's I think absolutely ridiculous. But let's just sort of flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, so it's interesting because Israel is accused of being an apartheid state. In other words, of inflicting perhaps having a different set of rights for Jews and Arabs in the state of Israel, and we'll talk about that in a second. But how many Jews are in Syria? How many Jews are in Lebanon? How many Jews are in Iraq, Kuwait, and Iran? The reality is Jews were ethnically cleansed from the Arab and Muslim world. And if we want to talk about apartheid and how the area is completely Judenrein, in other words, a land without Jews, let's look at the Middle East. Let's look at the broader Arab world. Okay, so let's park that conversation aside and let's talk about what exists in Israel proper. Arab Israelis proudly identify as such and say that they would rather live in Israel than in a future Palestinian state. Why? Because they know that Israel has entrenched equal rights for Jews and Arabs in all areas. There is not a law that discriminates against Arabs, not one whatsoever. And Arabs, thrive and live at the pinnacle of Israeli society, whether in business, whether as judges on Israel's Supreme Court, whether as top journalists, top surgeons and CEOs of major hospitals. So again, this is actually very similar to Holocaust denial. It's just another of many lies and libels that are waged at Israel, because Israel's detractors know. They know full well that they cannot beat Israel in the battleground, in actual tangible war. So they seek to annihilate Israel, the Jewish state, in the war of public opinion. And that's what they're trying to do. It's a war of attrition, a war of many wounds, and it's they're trying to kill Israel, not necessarily with the silver bullet, but with silver shrapnel. They are trying to wound and malign Israel to delegitimize it, whether it's with major corporations or with the what's regarded as the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, which a great example of how it has backfired is how Unilever, with Ben and Jerry's, the controlling owner of Ben and Jerry's, had called for a boycott of Israel, and what ended up happening, their share price dropped, I think something $20-some-odd billion, on the basis that their political position actually violated U.S. laws. So, the apartheid slur, the BDS movement, they are all hallmarks of anti-Semitism that deny equal standing to the Jewish people and that seek to spread falsehoods about the Jewish people.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that excellent clarification. And I think it's very important that if you're watching, listening, you grab that nugget of truth today, because sometimes we feel ourselves being swayed by some of this rhetoric, and we need to hold fast. We need to make sure that we understand how important it is to not slur any people. I would say, first of all, but in particular, as we're talking about anti-Semitism and the Jewish people, that we are very careful with all of this. Now, what we want to accomplish today with this conversation, Thursday is, the International Holocaust Memorial or Remembrance Day, and want to give people the tools to make sure that we can sort of put this never again idea into practice. And so we've talked about the importance of education. We've talked about, reading, given some instruction there. What are some other ways that we can best combat anti-Semitism around us today, and help people, really begin to make a difference?
I think it comes down to allyship and solidarity. For any of your viewers and listeners, if you've never had an opportunity to speak to a Jewish neighbor or somebody in the community, do it. Mm-hmm. Forge that coalition, because we are all about shared values. And we need to really work in lockstep. Education is certainly an important part of countering anti-Semitism, but building cohesive relationships based on mutual respect and Canadian values, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I agree. And Mike, it's been great to have the discussion today, and I want to just say to people watching or people listening, let's be the people who are proactive and who are warm and friendly to the Jewish people, and who call out those around us for being negative and for using anti-Semitic phrases, saying things that trivialize the Holocaust. I want to just, especially if you're a Christian today, I know that lots of people maybe are listening, but if you're a believer in Jesus and you follow his teaching, you need to be somebody who allies yourself with the Jewish people, and not someone who says, ridiculous things like that, vaccines and mandates, mask mandates and things are like the Holocaust. Like that is just such a stretch. And so I'm going to throw that out there. I'm going to maybe make some people angry today, but listen, that all that does is it minimizes and it trivializes what those Jewish people went through in the Holocaust, and those who survived as well, those who lost loved ones. How do you think they feel when they hear you say things like that? There's just, in my mind, zero comparison. And so we just encourage you, rethink some of those thoughts and ideas. I'm not anti-vaccine. I'm not pro-vaccine. I'm pro-people and pro-health. And so I just think that, as we have this discussion, this is one of those big conspiracy conversations that's happening out there. And I think we need to shut it down. And so wow, that just kind of came out today, Mike. But I don't know if you want to add anything. I don't know if you want to add anything to that before we finish.
Yeah. Dude, you cannot compare anything to the Holocaust. Nothing. There's just no way. There's this idea called Godwin's Law, that even on online social media discourse and elsewhere, that a conversation going on long enough will eventually devolve to the Holocaust and trivialization and analogies, and that's one of the biggest challenges. It always seems to, and it's being used for political whipping cards for politically expedient purposes for people to try to advance different political objectives, and it's just appropriation in the worst possible way. Yeah.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us again today. And if you have the time, you're watching, listening, between now and Thursday, one of the things we do, I don't have my paper with me, but we hold up a piece of paper that says "We Remember" with the hashtag "We Remember," and take a selfie of yourself, post it on social media. That's one way you can show solidarity for the Jewish people and for the survivors of the Holocaust and for those who were lost in the Holocaust. We want to, it seems like maybe a trivial thing to do, but there's power in numbers. And so let's support and do everything that we can, and get educated, learn all that you can, so that you can speak intelligently to this issue and align yourself with the Jewish people. Mike, thanks for being with us.
My absolute pleasure. And I echo everything you just said, Jeff, and amen, and amen, amen. Thank you.
Amen. Amen.
First Century Foundations is excited to tell you that we have some great Israel Christian-related content coming up on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe by clicking the button below so you can stay informed. If you're already subscribed, thank you.